Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to On the Real. I'm your host, Pastor Adam McCain. We're coming to you from the great campus of Christ for the Nations Institute here in Dallas, Texas. And you are going to love my guest today. I promise you, if you're watching or listening to this podcast, you do not want to miss a moment of it. So go ahead and turn down the speed on your treadmill so that you don't miss a word of it. With me today is Shani Ferguson. Shani and her family have ministered in Israel for many, many years. And the ministry's name is MAOZ. It took me years, by the way, to say that word right. And MAOZ, M-A-O-Z. And Shani is the Chief Creative Officer, Director, and just recently, your folks, who had been the presidents and CEO of that organization, just recently, in the last year or so, turned that over to you and your husband, Kobe. Mm-hmm. And the work that you do in Israel is phenomenal. And not only that, but she is a songwriter and producer, and really has brought modern worship to Israel. And to those connected with Israel. And Shani, it is a joy to have you on the podcast today.
A pleasure to be here.
So, and you're here in the United States, flew in a couple weeks ago, and you did, and I want you to talk about this for just a second. You did a tour of the U.S. this summer, and I got to actually be on one of your last stops. We were a group with a Messianic congregation, and you kind of did a conference, and it was phenomenal. Tell a little bit about that kind of tour and what you guys were doing.
Well, it was actually kind of a dream that we'd had for years to bring a large team that would essentially bring Israeli worship to Christians in the U.S. and Messianic Jews. And the reason is for the longest time there have been incredible songwriters and worship leaders who have played what is known as Messianic Jewish music, and it's what you would think of when you think of Messianic Jewish music, and the thing is that in Israel, Israeli music is very different, and so we've long wanted to kind of bring something to represent Israelis, and that was the idea behind it. So we started up in Pennsylvania and ended up down in Texas.
And what part of your team had never been to the United States?
Oh,
that
gosh,
fascinating.
we did have, we had several of them that. Oh gosh, I'm trying to think. At least 5.
Yeah, as you toured the countryside, they kept. When I got to talk to them, they're like, "It's so big.
It's so big.
It's so spread out."
It's like, okay, guys, we're gonna drive 10 hours, go to bed, and drive another 10 hours.
Yeah.
And like in Israel, you drive from tip to tip in less than 8 hours.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's if you're really going slow. So,
which is so interesting, right? That the whole world's fighting over this little plot of land.
No, it's.
How prophetic.
Of course they are. Of course they are. It's a plot of land that God said he likes, so of course everybody wants it.
So I want you to tell everybody, give a little quick history. You were born and raised in Israel, so kind of give us your story. Your mom and dad went there to be ministers, and kind of back us up on the history of Shani and the MAOZ family.
So my mom came actually first time 1959. Okay, this is when Israel was a lot smaller. They didn't have access to the Temple Mount, East Jerusalem, didn't have access to the Golan Heights, and she came on a tour with my grandfather, and then in 1967 she came on a tour with him again, and they were about to leave to go back to the U.S. and the cab was late. And so they're just kind of sitting there on the suitcases and they're talking, and the 6-Day War had just happened. And so
break everybody who don't understand the 6-Day War. Okay. Talk about that real quick. Significant.
So the
Sidebar.
6-Day War was essentially it became this, there was a threat against Israel. And so Israel preemptively did a preemptive strike.
Were they considered a nation at this point?
Yes, they were considered a nation.
NATO, everybody considered them?
Yes, everybody. I mean, a lot of people hated them, but they were considered a nation. And they, Ben-Gurion, who was our first prime minister, he just said, look, we believe that more land is supposed to belong to Israel, but we will take what we're given, and it'll be up to God to expand it or change it or whatever. So they are what they are. And so essentially there were several areas that were strategically difficult for Israel to handle. And one of them was the Golan Heights, because Syria was up on the mountains, and they would just take pot shots down at the villages down in on the border of Egypt, and then of course in Judea and Samaria, which is essentially known as the West Bank. So when the Independence War happened in 1948, Egypt took the Gaza Strip. Okay. Jordan took the west, what is become known as the West Bank, it's Judea and Samaria, and Syria took the Golan Heights. So none of those three countries were actually supposed to take any of that land. They weren't in the partition. They just occupied it.
Got it.
And so then in the 6-Day War, suddenly all these nations come and are fighting against Israel. And so Israel has a front against Egypt, and they're fighting against Jordan, and they're fighting against, and it was just this big, sudden, ambush.
Wow.
And mind you, Israel is less than 20 years old at this point, and they're just trying to build homes and kind of set up schools and hospitals.
Small population.
Very, very, very small. And so at this point, it just, if you read like all the stories of what happened during this 6-day period, Israel more than doubled its land mass in 6 days. More than
pushing
doubled.
Back these major countries.
Pushed them back, and just the stories are so phenomenal of like hands coming out of the sky and like all just crazy, crazy stuff. Looking and seeing tons of enemies, and then them just kind of dissipating or strategically.
Well, we don't hear about that.
No, and that's fascinating. My mother has written about them in the MAOZ Israel report in the past. Just fascinating stories of things that happened there, where you realize there's no reason in the natural why Israel should be able to should exist when there's that many enemies. A lot of people say, Israel's this dominant thing and they're attacking this. And it's like, you need to just take a second, look at the map and see what the Islamic world is around them, and see this one little tiny country. In any case, in 6 days, they recovered Judea and Samaria and East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights from Syria, Judea and Samaria from Jordan, and the entire Sinai Peninsula, not just Gaza, but the entire Sinai Peninsula. So if you see a map of during that time, it's just this huge area. And that was the moment in which there was like this euphoric moment of like, oh my goodness, the land, we now have the land. We now have access to the Temple Mount. That was the most significant thing. In terms of the Golan Heights, it was like a security thing. Like, we now have the mountains. So we're on top, and of course we're not going to shoot down on them. We just need to be on top so they won't shoot down on us. And so anyway, so that's when they did this tour, and for the first time.
So they're weeks, months, years. How far?
I think. It happened. It was just a few months after it happened. Maybe
they came and toured.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
After
my mom was actually here on the Independence Day after that happened, and she said it was the most magnificent Independence Day, where they had this big parade and they're all going to the old city, and there's recordings of the Jewish soldiers when they went into the Temple Mount and saw the Western Wall, and they're crying.
The Wailing Wall. They told me they couldn't even couldn't even fight anymore. They just would stop and just weep.
Yeah. So it's a very famous recording of like, we're going through the Lion's Gate, and we can see the Wailing when they're just crying. And really, this is the first time not only that Jews were given access, but that Christians were given access to that area where they could pray. Because any area that is going to be controlled by Muslims, you're not going to have freedom for Christians to pray. So if you go now to the Temple Mount today, which even though it's technically under Israel's sovereignty, they allow the Islamic areas to continue to serve Muslims, and they do not allow Christians or Jews to go up, obviously. It's kind of like Mecca.
Yeah.
So in any case, that's when my mother is sitting on a suitcase with my grandfather. They're waiting for the cab, and he said to her, my mother had been doing documentaries, and he said to her, why don't you make a documentary on like the miraculous thing that has just happened, the fulfillment of Scripture, the restoring land to the Jewish people. And so she said, okay. Well, yeah, let me see if I can pull it off in a few weeks or a few months. And of course, nothing in Israel happens in a few weeks or a few months. Nothing. But that was basically the beginning of her.
Was she single at the time?
She was single at the time. She was blonde, blue eyes, and single.
Yeah. California girl too, wasn't she? Yeah.
Born in Portland, raised in Texas.
Yeah. But she was spending her time out in California, right?
Yeah. That's where she met my dad.
Right.
Yeah. She spent some time in Spain.
Okay.
She was.
And your dad was this, and I've actually, by the way, I told him this. Your dad had played professional football, is that right? And then he got into acting in Hollywood, and he was actually on an episode of Chips.
Several.
Yep. And you know, I'm an old soul. And the other day, late at night, they had some old Chips episode, and I saw him.
You saw him.
I almost started texting you guys. I guess it's true. You aren't lying. He really was on there. He's a stud, man. He's such a cool dude, man.
That was actually that was what he was working on, I think, either right before or right after they were married. And he just realized, you know what, I need to stop this and go be in Israel and do what I'm supposed to be doing there. So he was like,
because he's of Israeli descent, right?
They're Jewish. Both my parents are Jewish. Yeah. So it was basically, she came and challenged him because she was traveling at this point to the U.S. In Israel. You know, she would go witness to people and they would come to the Lord, and then they'd say, you know, like, where's all the others? You know, this is fulfillment of scripture. We're like, where's all the others? And she's like, well, they're in exile. So I need to go get them. So she would travel
out in New York.
I said, So she would travel around and say, like, you're a Jewish believer. You need to come back to the land and help build a community. Wow. And there's a lot of leaders in Israel today that sat in a service with her saying, you guys
somewhere
need to come
in the world, and then said, okay, we're packing up.
A lot of them. Some of them took 20 years to move, and some of them came right away. But that was early on. So
MAOZ became one of the first kind of Messianic ministries there in Israel, right?
Yeah, and it really was birthed out of necessity. It wasn't like, hey, let's have a famous TV show, you know, because there was nothing like that. There was nothing fancy about ministry in Israel at the time. And the idea was, we need to create an organization that can help us bring over Jewish believers and start building a community and everything that goes along with that. And so they kind of sat and said, if we want to build a community from scratch, and this is a concept that a lot of Christians can't even fathom because they grew up in a Christian culture. Yeah. But if you were to start a cult, you know, from zero,
in a land that,
in the land where it originated,
there's no one else that is Christian.
Yeah, and if you want to start a community of Jewish believers in Israel, what do you need for said community? What are the building blocks of a healthy community? And so, it basically came down to kind of categories of, okay, so we need to have a congregation. Yeah. So you have a fellowship. You need to have resources in terms of like books and teachings and whatever. You need to have worship in Hebrew. That was a big stickler. There were several things that were not part of even the Jewish mindset in terms of Messianic Jewish mindset.
So speak to that about worship in Hebrew. Why was that such a hard place for them?
It's funny because we are creatures of habit. And what had happened, there was lots of Christian worship that was in English. And so when people would come and start a congregation, obviously my parents came from the States as well, they were used to hearing worship in English. And so when my parents were like, okay, we want to start moving towards an authentic Israeli expression, let's start by writing songs in Hebrew and singing songs in Hebrew. And even the Israeli believers, they would say like, oh no, I only feel the Holy Spirit when I worship in English, because that's just what they were used to. And so my parents had connected with several people who were songwriters, very, very talented. Some of them who had actually come when my mother had spoken at one of the meetings saying, you need to come over. And they would come and practice their songs at my parents' congregation and be like, go write some songs and let's try it, and see how it works. And so that eventually they kind of warmed up to it. And then at some point, they said, okay, well, let's get the speaking in Hebrew. Let's get the preaching in Hebrew as well. And that was when the fine line was, the line in the sand essentially was laid out, because at this point that meant the whole service would be in Hebrew. Yeah. And when you had people that were like in Israel, but not committed enough to learn the language. They're on a volunteer, like they're going to be there a year or two, whatever. Those people left.
But yet they were Jewish.
No.
Okay,
Some people would come in
All right, just
and
to be around the ministry to help. We're going to love
they're coming
Israel.
to Israel. We love Israel. We want to be here for a few years, whatever.
Sure.
But they're not committed enough to learn the language and the culture and whatever.
Wow.
So then what happened is my parents' congregation went from like 70 people, which back then was a mega.
Yeah, that's mega, mega in Israel.
From 7 to 20.
Oh, my God.
And so, but that was when they started building a Hebrew Israeli congregation. So that's when they planted the first Spirit-filled Hebrew-speaking congregation.
So what
in
are
the
you
country.
at this point? You're born and raised there, so you.
This was actually before, before I was born, or like very, very. I was like 3 or 4.
So you're already born into the vision. Hey, we have to have Hebraic worship, preaching.
I grew up essentially, and the funny thing is that a lot of the people that were coming over writing songs, it's not like Hebrew was their native language.
Right.
So a very safe thing to do was just to take the scriptures and put them to music. So there's all these scriptures of ancient Hebrew, which you wouldn't use in modern dialect, but in my mind, I know all these scriptures because I just grew up singing them.
Yeah.
So
Would you say, sidebar here on, so those coming back to Israel, which is what you had a lot of in your early childhood, so you're seeing more Russian Jews come, you're seeing more American Jews come back to Israel in this 70s, 80s.
Oh, it comes in
back.
waves. So the Russians were really big in the 90s.
So once the wall came down.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that was a huge thing. And it happened like right during the Gulf War. There was like an Ethiopian immigration and a Russian immigration that came in like massive
But they
waves.
saw themselves as Jews.
Yeah, I mean, they still brought vodka and bacon with them, but I mean, like they. And I mean, it's really big that in Israel you have these kind of like variations because there's a very strong Russian Orthodox influence on the culture, even in the thing. So Jewish culture. So you have the Novi God tree, and they celebrate it like for New Year's, even though it looks like a Christmas tree. They wouldn't call it a Christmas tree. They don't celebrate Christmas. But it's Santa Claus and it looks like a Christmas tree, and they call it Novi God, and that's how they celebrate. And so anyway, it's just there's this whole.
So you're talking about lots of dynamics culturally.
Lots of cultural.
Because you're not
mishmash.
How much of the culture even today is original Middle Eastern Jewish culture?
Yeah, well, you're going to have there's a lot of Moroccan Jews and Persian Jews, and I mean, just the Jews came from all over, and so there's we have these jokes of like, oh, if you're a Ima Parsit, you're a Persian mom, then you have these certain tendencies.
Okay.
If you're a Moroccan mom, it's like, oh, she's like this, she's a Moroccan mom. So a lot, the Russians were very, very proud of their culture. So they almost kind of created this own subculture because they came like 1 million of them in a 1 or 2 year period when our population was like 4 million.
You don't
at
even
the
have
time.
housing
Anyways.
for that kind of.
Yeah. Oh no, it was a complete mess.
Wow.
In fact, some of the politicians that had land allowed their land to be used. They just like put all these what do you call them, the RV things,
like RV parks and like
They just like stuck them in there and just did what they could because they were fleeing Russia. It wasn't like wait your turn and so there's always like this kind of urgency and desperation when Jews finally decide they're going to come. They've had all this time, and then like when they finally come,
and they come in waves, right?
They come in waves, yeah. So.
Wow. So you've been through all of those as a child into adulthood of watching all that.
Of watching the waves of people come in. And it's interesting because a lot, Jews are always looking at the long story and
explain that. Yeah.
I just, as a culture, who we identify as is like, we're looking back thousands of years and subsuming that into who we see ourselves as. And so we're also looking forward and saying like, we want to live in such a way that will matter 100 years and 1,000 years from now. So one of the things
I don't think Americans think like that.
No, they don't. It's very Western that if I say to you, hey, tell me about yourself, you'll be like, oh, I was born in such and such, whatever. I grew up in this place. I worked at this place, whatever, because in the Western mind, the universe began when you were born.
That's right.
Okay. So, but in the Jewish mind, if you ask them, it'll be like, oh, my grandmother was here, and then she moved to here, and then they came to here, and then my parents moved to here, and then they get to them because they just realize how much of who they are depends on what generations before them did. So, anyways, but the politicians were saying, look, guys, and they were saying this to our nation, this is going to be a few rough years. Okay. It was really messy. It was very hard. They didn't have the resources. We weren't
This is the early 90s.
This is the early 90s. We were under attack from Iraq.
Yeah.
It was literally like immigrate, go to your place, here's a gas mask. Like that was the experience of
Oh my goodness.
a lot of people. But
welcome home.
Yeah.
Out of communism into threats of being destroyed every day.
Into living in a country where you can actually defend yourself.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that was the deal. It's like, yes, we're under threat, but you're under threat over there and you can do anything about it. Here you have a government that's going to fight to protect you. So, what the politicians were saying is, look, right now it's hard, but in 10, 20 years, we're bringing engineers and doctors and brilliant minds and whatever. And it's going to be hard right now because they don't even know the language and they're working as like school guards and, shopkeepers and whatever when they had engineering jobs and like all these whatever. Just wait, just give it a decade or two. We are bringing brilliant minds here. And now you look like we're like the high tech. Everyone's like, why do you have so many like high tech this and all these inventions or whatever?
So high tech.
So they were seeing into the future and willing to take the heat in the moment and try to make it work.
Explain, because you mentioned the high tech and you also threw out, you guys end up with, missiles being shot over at you kind of on a weekly basis. Talk about the dome. I mean, I thought that was super cool. What do you call it?
The Iron Dome.
The Iron Dome.
Yeah.
As far as like your technology.
Yeah. It almost feels like there's like this.
Is it a national secret that we all can't know about it? I mean,
nobody knows about how it works. They're not dumb enough to. I actually remember at one point the UN passed a resolution upset at Israel for not giving the Iron Dome to Gaza so that they could protect themselves too from our rockets. It was one of those things. I was like, really?
Yeah. Well,
really? Okay.
Sure, weapons.
Yeah. So, the Iron Dome is definitely Israel's one of its pride and joys, and one that improves every time we're under attack. It goes from like 87% success, 92% success. I think we were like up to 97% success, and it's something that is it's literally like shooting a bullet out of the air from miles away.
So as they start,
and it's not a bullet that's going straight. It's
right.
like this.
Yeah. As you're being fired upon, you have defense weapons that literally will blow the rockets out of the air before they hit their mark.
Yeah. And some of these rockets are 15 seconds from the time they take off to landing. And some of them, so if you live close to Gaza, you got 15 seconds to go from wherever and whatever it is you're doing into a bomb shelter. We're in Jerusalem, so we have like 90 seconds.
So twice a year, 10 times a year?
It just depends. Jerusalem, generally, you're really stupid if you're shooting on Jerusalem because it's still considered a capital city, and you get a lot of international support when someone fires on your capital city. So
politically, it's not smart.
Politically, it's very stupid.
But Gaza, on the other hand.
So, well, when Gaza fires on Ashdod, Tel Aviv, Tel Aviv is also a big kind of no-no because it's half the country lives in the Tel Aviv area. So, but it's funny because we're very, it's kind of like, okay, the rockets are coming. And I remember one time we were working on a website project, and we were on the phone with a guy who was coding. Yeah. And he was in Ashdod, I think. And they had a minute, 15 seconds, or they had 45 seconds. I'm pretty sure. It was something like that. Yeah. And he's like, "Oh, is that a siren on the background?" He's like, "Yeah." It's like, I got like 45 seconds. I can finish this line, and then I'll go to the bomb shelter, because it's like, okay. I mean, the thing that Israelis like to do most when these things happen is live their lives as normal as possible.
That's kind of like stick it to the man.
That's how we stick it to them. It's the worst insult in the Middle East when someone's like, yelling obscenities at you, and you just keep walking, like you just don't even. It's like
that makes sense now. Right? Thank you. I needed that. Last time I was there, these guys are just fussing, and the other guys just walking past them, and they're like getting more mad.
Yeah.
I'm like, that's what I'm gonna do next time.
Yeah. That's what I try to tell all the males who drive in cars that get mad. I'm like, you just keep driving. There is no greater victory than like
it has no effect on
literally
me. I am more
even
powerful.
Yeah.
That's great. And so once or twice a year, you guys are throwing yourself in the bomb shelters?
No, I mean, again, when you're down near Gaza for a while, it was on a weekly basis, and then never hit the news. You wouldn't know about it. They were just firing just hundreds of, and it was just constant. When they didn't fire rockets, they sent over kites. They would like floating balloons, and they would put explosives on them. So they would just land anywhere randomly, mostly in fields. And when they exploded, they'd set the fields on fire because especially in the summer, it gets really hot and dry. Destroyed whole wildlife reserves. It was very much like, Solomon and the baby.
Yeah.
If we can't have it, we're just going to destroy it type thing. It wasn't like we love our land and we want it so much. It's just like, you can't have it type thing. So,
and what do you do with the drones now that they can just fly a drone?
Oh, they can't bring drones out.
Because of your system, right?
Anytime a drone is anywhere near, we know about it. Before they made the drone,
that's the big piece, really, about this whole thing is that you guys have so much
intelligence,
intel that you know before they're. Hey, I think we might. Nope, you can't do it.
We know about the drone before the guy who made it was born.
Right.
And
That was the best that the generals were telling us while we were there. That one time I took a trip that we ended up with some great people. So in your time I want you to give us. We call this on the real.
Okay.
Not what we preach, not what we write books about, but like behind the scenes when we're talking in the green room. So what is it like? Give us the lowdown on. You grew up. Mom and Dad picked to move us here. You were born here, so it's the only thing you know. But to do ministry in a place like this, to give yourself completely to this cause. Times where you were like, what have I done? Do I want to be this person? I know we all have our struggles. So just tell your storyline and just kind of like, it wasn't all,
Yeah.
Thank you, Jesus, for my calling.
Yeah. I never had I wish we could go back to America because I wasn't born here.
Right.
I know my
So
accent, everyone hears it and they're like, oh, you're American? No, I'm not. We lived here for 2 years when I was in the 4th and 5th grade. And my brother we basically had to bring my brother here to go to a special school where he wasn't learning. He was in the 4th grade, couldn't spell his name. His name has 3 letters. So they brought him here to learn. And during that time, I lost my Israeli accent. And so that has haunted me ever since. But I remember being 18 or somewhere around there, 19, and thinking, or maybe I was even 20 by then. And I was in Bible school, went to the States in Bible school. And I remember a guy coming from China, and he was talking about he did ministry in China and how they were treated terrible and they would be arrested and they would bring in these doctors to who knew where the most painful ways to torture. It was just this really, it's the Chinese. So they do all things very,
complete.
Complete.
Pain.
And
complete.
So I remember thinking that sounds so much more exciting than going back to Israel. That's how much I didn't want to go back to Israel because it's a difficult place. It's a hard culture. It's spiritually heavy. The fruit is very you earn your fruit. Yeah. And I like to describe if the U.S. and Western environments are like a basketball game in terms of every minute or two you got there's another basket. You're scoring. It's this is exciting. We got 100 and something points. Israel's a soccer game.
Yeah, it is.
It was
you just put it in perspective.
Almost,
Missed again.
And you're going back and forth. You could have 90-minute game and 0-0.
Someone almost came to. Oh, never mind.
Right, and so sometimes the only times you score is when there's a pendel. How do you say pendel and whatever the pen? I don't know how you say it in English, but anyway. The foul thing where you get to...
the penalty kick.
Penalty kick, okay.
And that's a guy who hates soccer. Look at me. I can't even tell you what the positions are. I know there's a goalie.
I only ever hear about soccer in Hebrew, so I don't even know how
to... Well, we're Americans. We don't have one football that we care about.
So anyway, but I... It's just so hard there, and I was done. I was like, I want to go somewhere else. I appreciate all the nice insight that I have for someone who's grown up there, but I want to go somewhere where I can feel successful,
experience revival,
and just not feel like you're just climbing up a cliff at all times. And I had this very powerful experience when I was 20. And it was just this time of worship, this big event. And I was doused with the most intense burden for Israel.
Wow.
And
so you had to get your own burden. God had to give you that. You couldn't just grow up in your mom and dad's burden.
You just don't survive there unless you really, really are supposed to be there. Yeah. And to have the burden of like, I want to see my people restored to the Lord, is what makes me able to push through, because it hasn't gotten any easier.
Right.
It's still super hard. It's stupid expensive to live there. I was actually over at a friend's house here in Dallas, and he's like, "Yeah, I paid it was $150,000 or something for my house several years ago. Now it's like we're $3 million."
Yeah.
I'm like, "Oh, okay, that's great." Because this house that you're talking about is like $2 million in Israel. Okay.
Wow.
And they were thinking like, "Oh, we're not wealthy people and we're not, whatever. We just like middle class, that kind of thing." I was like, "You could not." I was like, "You don't understand the fact that you can even afford a house like this. Israelis live in these little tiny dumps, pay a ton of money for those dumps, and
work 2 jobs to pay for that."
Yeah, for sure. So the taxes are high. The culture is hard. A lot of them lives in these dumps without air conditioning. I don't know if you've ever been. I don't know if you ever tried to be effective and efficient in a room where there's no AC.
Wow.
But we've had a few summers like that, and I just was like, "God, if you want me to get anything done, I just really."
Just a little bit of wind.
I was like, I can handle this. I won't complain. I can handle the heat. I'll just lie down on the floor here and absorb the cool from the concrete. But if you want me to get anything done, if you need me to use my brain, then and then this guy calls up out of nowhere and he's like, "You know what just happened? I work in the oil fields out in Texas, and we are out here and it's like 100-degree weather and our air conditioner broke." And then and we had, somehow he had heard us he was a friend of ours. So he just heard us being like, "Oh man, AC, blah, blah, blah." And he was like, "And I just had a day or 2 of that." And I was like, "I am buying them in air conditioning." And
let's go oil field, man.
I was like, "Thank you.
Send your millions."
So we got one in the living room.
And
great. I just slept in the living room the whole summer. I was like,
Yeah. Well, and then a congregational worship in those environments. We can't even get guys to come to church in the summertime if we can't get it down to the 70s.
Right.
170 degrees.
See, you guys do things too cold. I don't understand. America needs to repent from its fascination with 65-degree church services. I'm sorry.
We got a little bit more body fat than everybody else, so we need it.
Okay, well,
I think
I'm just saying, I come to America and I don't care what season it is. I bring a coat, like a coat, like I'll keep you warm because it's Arctic.
One of the things I've always appreciated about you and your husband is that you do love the people of Israel so much. And last time he was in, I was able to have him on the podcast on The Real here. And he talked about, not just ministering to Israelis, but also because Israel is much populated with Israelis as
Arab.
Jews
as well as Arabs. So you have Israeli Arabs and Jewish.
Right. Yeah, that's what I wanted to make sure I got the verbiage right.
Mm-hmm.
And the difficulty for Arabs to really convert.
Right. So if you have, this is really confusing to a lot of people because
bring that truth to us.
So you're in overall in terms of the majority of the demographics. If you're an Arab, you're either born a Muslim or you're born a Christian. Now, anyone who knows what being an actual Christian is, or a believer, understands that nobody's ever born a Christian. So what this actually means is, if you call yourself a Christian Arab, which is a large population of Christian Arabs in
Israel,
it means nothing. It means you're not Muslim. Okay. That's basically what it means. Right. And if you, as a Christian Arab, have an encounter with the Lord and become what we would call a born-again believer, the Christian Arabs consider you to have converted outside of their religion. Mm-hmm.
So would they be a Christian like Catholicism?
Yeah, they're like Catholic, sometimes Armenian, Roman, Greek Orthodox, that kind of real high.
But they have never had an encounter with the Lord.
Don't read the Bible. Don't may come on like Christmas and Easter. No,
don't. Jesus.
Don't even know Jesus was Jewish. But so the actual, because Messianic Jews are a minority in Israel. We're 0.00001%.
Right.
Christian born again Arabs are the minority in Israel. There is no smaller group of believers in Israel than the born again Arabs. So we really, really have a heart for them. They're hard to find because obviously they're not advertising.
Here I am.
Hey guys, we're born again Christian Arabs. But when
to know.
It's hard. It's hard for them, and so
because they're isolated from family, all those things happen.
Yep. They'll be
ostracized. Yep.
So when we find them, then we really like to invest in them and build relationships and see them succeed. And especially if they have visions for doing ministry or having a business or whatever. MAOZ, which is the word. And I just realized, if you say the word shalom, you have an ah and an o in there, right? Okay. And it's the exact same thing with MAOZ. So MAOZ, shalom.
Shalom, MAOZ.
Yeah, shalom.
Yeah,
what
did I always called it? MAOZ.
MAOZ or MAOZ.
MAOZ.
Yeah. In Asia, we realized when we were translating, because we translate our report, the MAOZ Israel report, into Korean.
Okay.
And like and Chinese at one point, and like everyone was confused because they thought we were talking about Mao's thing, and we're like, no, that is not at all.
You should have started them with shalom, then they could have gotten it. Shalom, Mao. See, you missed it. Yeah, I want you to talk about this real quick. You recognized a truth a few years back, and I remember when you started really telling us about it, that the real way to touch the hearts of Israelis is through the universal language of music. Mm-hmm. And you always had a gift towards that, and songwriter, musician, and amazing voice. And you began to ask those who supported you missionary-wise and or ministry-wise, to hey, could you help us build studios so we could get folks in here? Great musicians don't have a place to even perform or produce. And you guys were able to put a studio together, and that has just taken off. So cast a little bit of the vision on why that was so important, and the lives you're seeing touched and changed because of it.
Right. I will say it's fascinating to try to whenever we do a campaign or hey guys, let's go, when you say I want to go get Israelis saved and we're gonna go stand on the street corner and hand out tracts, like, oh my gosh, people start throwing all sorts of money at you and like, yeah, let's do that, because that in their mind
that's evangelism
is evangelism. Okay, in Israel you are dealing with an incredibly complex culture
and to your point, thousands of years of history. By saying my great grandmother was this, and then my grandmother was my great grandma, and so I identify through the history of. So if my history was this, why would you think I would convert quickly
you think
away
some
from
guy standing on the street with a tract is going to change that?
So good when you
get something
brought
else.
that forward. Yeah.
So basically, it's fascinating trying to explain to people that even though it looks like, hey guys, we have a recording studio, you want to put out music.
Yeah.
It's not like we're in Nashville and we have a market and, like, hey, it's kind of like, why would you want me to, support a record album? Aren't you going to sell it? And it's like, okay, let me explain what we're doing, because first of all, if King David were alive today, he would have a recording studio. I just want to say that, it's true. So, and his heart was worship, and his heart, was even more so. So, if I can kind of back up and say and explain the vision and the reason behind what we're doing, I think it can help give context as to why we would even bother, because God knows working with creative people is not the easiest mission to take on. If it was already we're dealing with a cantankerous people group, and then we take the creatives among the cantankerous people group.
That's a group.
But so basically I was years ago, I was really praying about the culture, because when I grew up in Israel, it was a pretty innocent culture. Not like everyone was holy or anything, but it was, like the worst kids in my school smoked a cigarette and drank a beer and played the guitar. That was like the,
rebellious ones.
That was the super
rebellious. And we're not even talking about 40s or 50s.
No, thank you. No,
I mean, when you think about
it wasn't. It was 80s
movies,
and 90s.
Yeah,
okay.
Right.
And so, and then you kind of fast forward to today, and it was like, oh my gosh, like the level of deterioration culturally. We are if you kind of look at like, what culture accepts A, B, C, D, F, G of the worst of the worst? Israel, everything. Okay.
Yeah.
Sadly, we do everything well. So if we're going to follow the Lord, we're going to do it really good. If we're not, we're going to do that really good.
All the Texans were mad at you guys because you started getting your vaccinations right away, and all the Texans were like, shouldn't get no vaccinations.
Oh my gosh, yeah, that was
but to your point, you do it all in.
We do all in. We'd all in, and for all of those that heard all sorts of rumors that they were forcing people to do, that did not happen. But in any case, so I was saying, okay, so in one sense, you have a people group who have, high tech, agriculture breakthroughs, medical breakthroughs, like, we found a cure to cancer. That we invented like a Band-Aid that you can use in the battlefield if someone is bleeding and it just seals in the wound. Like all sorts of, you can go down to Africa and show people how to do agriculture in the desert. Like we're being a blessing whether we want it or not, right? This is like what God said was going to happen. And then at the same time, as a culture, we're deteriorating. And I was like, morally, we're deteriorating. And at the same time, we're having these successes. And I was wrestling with like, this looks like the blessing of God. Then why is it not here? And I felt like he kind of took me through the scriptures, and, God shows us his ways a lot of time in patterns of like, this is how I did it before. This is how I'm gonna do it again. A lot of times you can be like, I know what's going to happen because this is how we did it last time. And a lot of times when we need a breakthrough, we're like, we know that you've done this before. You can do this again, right? So this is where we build our stuff. We understand that God does things a certain way. He's showing us. So when you have Moses taking the children of Israel out of Egypt, he brings them to the mountain, and they're going to have a talk. God and his new people group are gonna have a talk. And the reason I say new is because he had chosen them from the time of Abraham, but this was the first time that they would be a free people. So Israel was born in slavery. 400 years of slavery. It's all they ever knew as a people group. There was no one alive who knew anyone who had been alive, who knew anyone who had been alive that had ever known freedom. So he's basically taking them to this mountain, and he's like, you're going to represent me. And I need to explain a few things, okay? Because you can't take this slavery mindset into, we're the people of God. And so he brings them to the mountain, and he starts telling them, okay, don't do this, do this, don't do that. Like if you're personal responsibility, if your bull takes out your neighbor's donkey, get your neighbor a new donkey. Okay. Like if this person does this, you take responsibility, treat each other well, treat each other with respect. When you sin, this is how you take care of it. Even, hygiene things, just everything. It's just like when there's mold in your house, destroy that house.
That's hilarious.
There's like all sorts of stuff that like, if you didn't know science back then, he's just like telling you all this stuff. So he's giving them this is how you are going to behave as representatives of me. And then he sets up a group of people whose role it was to essentially worship, to create an atmosphere of worship that would permeate throughout the camp.
Think about that. Not a group of carpenters, not a group of scientists. We're going to set up a whole group of people that their whole role is to permeate worship to Jehovah in our midst.
Now, why is this important? Because, let me say it like this. Have you ever been in a service, and I'm assuming more than once, where you had a powerful experience of the presence of God? It just filled you. It's euphoric. It's like you just give me a dead person, like I'm praying for anybody. And you leave the place and you're just like, you feel so much love for people, and you're not feeling like your agitation in your flesh and whatever. And like, it's like, oh, sure, you can take my parking spot, like,
bless you.
That's just a fender bender. Don't worry about it. Like, it really doesn't bother you. Okay. Why? Because you're experiencing the presence of God empowering you to be who he created you to be. And you're not feeling the friction that your flesh is usually giving off. And so this essentially was the role of the Levites to create this atmosphere of worship that should you choose to embrace and live in, you can be this representative of God that he's called you to be. So that's kind of like the idea, right? It's two train tracks. It's both and. It's not one, or it's not just like, oh, let's just worship and we just do whatever we want, act however we want. It was both. And so, so they didn't exactly do it right, and they made a lot of mistakes, and they didn't have good leaders, and sometimes they would and sometimes they wouldn't. And so they get removed from the land, and they come back with Nehemiah. And during the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, and at one point, Nehemiah's going back and forth, and the people are kind of rebuilding, and it's really fascinating, actually. If you read Ezra and Nehemiah, what you're going to find is a parallel story to what's happening today on the political scene.
Oh, wow.
They come back, they're rebuilding, and the locals start going to the king and saying, oh, they're bad, and they're this, and it's like exactly what is happening with the UN and that whole thing. It's like you just read it, and you're like, oh my gosh, it's like literally history repeating itself. So
cycles.
Exactly. So Nehemiah comes back. They've already had the dedication. They've like rebuilt the city. They did it valiantly with the, sword in one hand and a brick in the other. And he's like, hey guys, how's it going? Where's he said, he walked by the house of the Lord, and the house of the Lord lay desolate. And he's like, where's the Levites, guys? And they're like,
who?
Oh, they're out in the fields, they're working out in the fields. And he's like, what in the world, guys? Like, if we're not going to be the people of the presence of God, what are we doing here? We can't
cultivate that, right?
If we don't have this, because what's the point of being the people of God? It's if you're a pagan and you live in, whatever, which there's specific stories just like this. You're some pagan guy, powerful, not powerful, whatever. Your idols aren't answering your prayers. Right. You hear there's a God in Israel. You can walk yourself over to Israel and experience the presence of God dwelling among a people. That was the point. He wanted to have a prototype to eventually draw the nations. Whatever. So if they're not doing that, it's like, what are you even doing here?
Right.
So he, beats them up, rips their beard out, does a whole nine things that'd be get him in trouble today. But and it says, and he goes and he reinstates the male and female singers, the musicians, songwriters, whatever. He reinstates them in their posts because he just understands the significance of this as Israel fulfilling its destiny. And so if you fast forward to today, we're in the same situation. We've rebuilt our schools, our hospitals, governments. We have our structure per se,
roads and everything,
and we don't have our Levites. And so I just looked at it, and it's like you have a malnourished child. In one sense, it's growing, it's getting big, it's whatever. In another sense, there's areas that are not developing, and it's becoming a malnourished child. And so that was kind of like the behind the scenes of, okay, we really need to find and restore modern day Levites. Now, let me just clarify, because I don't want to get super mystical about this and be all weird. Nobody knows what tribe they are of today. And I understand that some people last name Cohen, but look, with all due respect, my great grandfather could have changed their name. And so maybe it is, maybe you are, if you're Cohen, maybe you really are of that lineage. It's just not for sure. And so we're not going to be like, oh, if your last name's Cohen, come, we're doing auditions. Okay. Besides the fact that King David had more influence on worship than anybody we know. And he was from the tribe of Judah. So the bottom line is what we're looking for is Israelis who have a call to be worshipers. And we are looking for them and looking to cultivate them into a healthy place, not just musically, but also spiritually and emotionally, because there's nothing worse than having a worship leader or someone who's a very, very talented musician who's just an emotional and spiritual wreck. It only damages them and only creates chaos. We actually dubbed our studio the rehab center for emotionally damaged worship leaders.
I love that.
Because that's what we were getting. They would just come and just be like, wow, we really like the atmosphere here and the way you guys are just warm and affectionate and family oriented, and it's just like the vibe here is great. And even non-believers come in and they're like, what's this vibe here? And they're like, let me tell you about that.
Let me tell you about that vibe. Called the glory.
The bottom line is, if you were to look at the restoration of modern day Levites, what would it look like on a practical level? That's what we're doing.
That's powerful. Yeah, I'm so proud of you in that. All right, listen, with the little bit of time we have left, here's what I want you to do. I want you to give us the Cliff Notes for all the stuff that we Americans have no idea what all these Christian things are talking about. All these, late night Christian television programs about the red heifer and the
You want me to close out by insulting everyone?
No, I don't. I just want you to bring some clarity. Like, where should we, I mean, you and I have had long talks about some of this in the past, and your husband, but just kind of like.
Yeah, but they were in your living room.
Yeah,
you want me to say
but it's called On the Real. It's called On the Real, like behind the scenes, without offending everybody.
Right.
Just where should we land on some of these things? Like,
okay.
where have you landed?
Yeah.
Tell us. Like what should we super be concerned about, and what should we the Lord will work that out some way.
Right. I will say then when it comes to end time stuff, I'm very hands off because the only thing I know for sure is that nobody knows how it's going to work out. Okay, we can guess, we can look at scriptures and say maybe this, but anyone who's like absolutely is going to happen absolutely this way, it's just like, guys, come on, seriously.
Well, explain to us the whole Temple Mount thing and resetting that up and the rebuilding and why.
Yeah.
What's even.
So I've had people ask me like, what about the third temple being rebuilt? I said, okay, just so you know, there's about 100 people in Israel who are thinking about the rebuilding of the temple out of 9.5 million.
Okay.
So there's like this, what's it called? Some like school of like ultra Orthodox.
Yeah.
And the other thing that you need to know is, should there be a rebuilding of a temple? Let's say it happens. Okay. I don't know that it will. Let's just say it happens. And those people are like, absolutely in the scripture. They're like, seriously guys, I don't know that it will. Okay. But if it does, let me explain what this would look like. No women and no Christians would be allowed to go there. So whatever fantasy Christians have in their mind in terms of like, oh, it's just going to be great. Really, animal sacrifices, this is what we're going for nowadays. So I'm not going to tell people what to do.
Because the reason why those deeply strict Orthodox do not do the animal sacrifice because they don't have a temple.
Correct.
Right? That's why they say that they don't
do animal
adhere to that
right.
anymore.
And really one of our arguments when we present them with the message of Yeshua is you don't have a way to sacrifice and we have a sacrifice to offer you. So to kind of like return to that, again, even in the scripture when Nehemiah restored the Levites, he restored female singers, but the Orthodox Jews, they forbid women from singing. They say it's too whatever pretty or whatever. That's why we're not allowed to have, walk around with hair either because women are too whatever. But what I would say to that is, first of all, Israel has a lot of things that are fascinating about it. It's the story of the ages, and God is full of, mysteries. It's just who he is, and he loves to like lay things out so we can discover them. That should not dominate our thoughts when we're thinking of Israel. Israel's, first of all, a people group with a specific calling. The people that live there today are the descendants of the people that lived there. They're the descendants of the heroes of the Bible.
Yeah.
And so when you think of Israel, you should first think of the people. Then there's the land. And yes, there's some really cool things that happen there. So if you go on a tour, absolutely, Jesus walked. We don't know where he walked, but different people walked in different areas. I heard one guy said he went to Israel and he said, I want you to take me somewhere Jesus walked. So they dropped him out in the desert.
Somewhere out here, buddy.
We know he wandered around here.
At least 40 days.
But the thing is, when it comes to the red heifer, again, there's just the fixation on rebuilding the temple is not something Christians should really focus on, because there's just nothing about that will bring Yeshua closer to his people. Good. Okay, that's number one. In terms of, again, when the blood moon and whatever, the seasons, these things are given to us as clues. So I'm not going to say like entirely throw it out, whatever. Just sometimes it's not always the full story. And really a lot of times what happens is people look at these scriptures as if they were just written and there's no way that they've been fulfilled in the past 2,000 years since they were written. And that's something we need to consider. Maybe some of the stuff that were like end times, tribulation, maybe it already happened. Yep. Because there were some pretty rough times just because we didn't live through them. And, we didn't have movies about them and
Right.
whatever, so we think they
Right.
weren't that bad, but there was horrific things that happened. So A, consider that they could have already happened. B, if they haven't happened, we don't know exactly how. And C, it's really not the focus.
It's not.
It can be cool. It can be interesting,
Yeah.
whatever. But if that's your fascination, then you're looking at Israel like a chess piece and not a people group with a destiny.
Yeah. And well said. And then, as I look at it, all of the end time prophecies in Scripture, and they all have the same theme, and that is live ready for God.
Mm-hmm.
So none of it should surprise you or harm you or hurt you.
Right. Actually, that's one other important thing, because I feel like, how we say Jews look forward and they're always thinking like, how can I live in such a way that my kids and my grandkids, will benefit,
right.
whatever. Christians have this thing of like, Jesus is coming back tomorrow, so I'm not going to plan for anything. Okay.
Right.
So you have like 2,000 years of Jesus is coming back tomorrow and I'm going to plan for anything. And so you have generation after generation that is practically starting from scratch and really missing out on the benefit of like, look,
Legacy, yeah.
I'm a 43-year-old woman who's running a huge ministry that I'm benefiting from. There's no way I could start in my lifetime and get to this place and have the influence that I have, except for that my parents just spent 45 years doing it. My grandparents spent a bunch of years doing it. And so I'm like picking up something that is already ripe and rich and amazing. And now we have time and energy to take it forward to another place. And those are things that I think Christians would really benefit from considering that. And the scripture, I believe it's in, I want to say Luke 15, but Yeshua is saying, blessed is the servant who is found working when the master comes. Yeah. So yes, live ready, but work as if he's not coming back for 1,000 years.
Yeah, right. Yeah, well said. As we close out our time, thank you. Mm-hmm. Such a privilege always to have you. Would you just pray for those who are listening? First off, that their love for Israel would, I know that you're always believing for that, and then also that their love for Israel would expand, as well as that they would be, in whatever geographical area they live, that they would be a voice of worship and bringing forth his, his outer glory, if you will. There's that expression in the earth that brings forth, it changes the atmosphere. So those pieces that are on your life.
Father, I thank you for this time with Adam and for all those that are listening. And I pray that you would take them on a personal journey with this special and unique people group, Israel, that you would give them your heart for Israel, that you would show them where they fit in the story, that they aren't this separate, rejected. They were grafted in. They have the same access to you as Israel, but that they can play a part in the story of Israel. God, I pray that those who don't understand Israel, they kind of understand that there's something there, but not exactly. God, that you would bring people into their lives that can help expand that you would bring Israelis and Jewish people into their lives so that they can see your people as a people first, and see your faithfulness to them, and therefore understand that you will be faithful to those who call on your name. You have been faithful to Israel throughout all these years, despite Israel's unfaithfulness, and you will be faithful to Christians who call on your name, Father. And I pray that you would help our listeners really find a place in you where your glory shines through, God. Each one with their unique giftings. It doesn't have to look any particular way, but that you would give them opportunities to shine the light that you have put in them into the people around them, and especially to any Jewish people that are around them that need to experience the God of Israel and really don't know how to get back to you. In Yeshua's name.
Amen. Well, you heard it here on the Real.